Chanda K, which is for sale here. This was their second anthology of these types of stories. This starts with a young woman who's in Scotland to do some research for her doctorate on folklore. And I'm going to start sort of in mini arrays, and so I hope you can follow it. Her head snapped up, adrenaline flooding her body. Then she heard it again, the hollow pound on the door, the knock echoing through her chest and her head and scattering the cobwebs in her mind. She reached to snap on the little lamp, unwound and rose unsteadily as her book and pad slipped sideways between the seat cushion and the arm of the chair. Quickly recovering her slippers, she padded toward the door, cold air swirling around her ankles. She instinctively pulled her robe together, not only tying it, but gripping the fabric closer with one hand as if it were armor enough to fend off a midnight burglar, who would hardly be knocking at the door, she reminded herself. The knocking had stopped. Sidling up to the door warily, she risked a glance out the peephole, half expecting to find a wild horse's eye, the accusage peering back. Instead, all she saw there was an apparently young man standing in the dim light falling from the gap in the front room's less than designer curtains. He looked relatively well dressed, with an overcoat, now dark and wet, thrown over his shoulders like a cloak, and held tight with one hand beneath his chin. She could just make out a shirt, dress slacks, and nice dark shoes under the coat's tent. A cap hid his hair for the most part, although a few curls escaped in the back, dark and plastered to his neck. His face was turned, looking back down the narrow road that ran in front of the cottage and a handful of others, heading off east for the still smaller village of Altholi, and west down into the streets of Inchin. She straightened, torn between good manners and common sense. It was pouring rain, but she had no idea who he was. Of course, that didn't mean much here. She had discovered the Scots were a friendly folk, more so than their English neighbors to the south. She leaned to the peephole on probably 90 miles, in a storm, practically in the middle of nowhere. She reached for the bolt, wondering what in God's name she was thinking. Wind and rain whooshed in as she opened the door a crack, no more. She said, "Hello," she said tentatively. He wrinkled his nose against water running down into his eyes and wiped one hand across them, managing to smile at the same time, and cocked his head in bashful courtesy. "Sorry to bother you so late, but I saw your light on. I'm bound for Inchin, and my ride's given out. All I need is to give some friends a tinkle to come and fetch me up. Do you mind?" His smile was gentle and white against a tanned face with a strong jaw and finely cut features, and a winning smile. She looked up the road, feeling foolish, for there was nothing to be seen in the pouring rain and the darkness. Streetlights weren't exactly as common in the Scottish countryside as they were in the States. Meanwhile, he waited in the rain, eyebrows raised hopefully as he struggled not to blink under the stream running down his cap's bill, and looking more like a bedraggled cocker spaniel than any axe murderer possibly could. She immediately felt contrite and opened the door. "I'm so sorry. Come in." He stepped in, paused on the entry rug, and shrugged apologetically. "I'm afraid I'm a bit wet." The delicate turn of the Scots tongue made it come out "wait." She loved the sound of that soft brogue, so different from the Irish even, although I must say I'm probably murdering it here. Hospitality, the ancient code, swept over her. So far she'd found the Scots an outgoing, gentle people compared to the English, especially once they discovered her reason for being here. She'd been invited to tea, dinner, lunch, and even breakfast, and heard every local variant of the old tales, whether she wanted to or not. Given local superstitions and her own luck, she thought, she'd probably just opened the door to the love talker. She turned away to hide a blush at that thought. It had been way too many months and too many classes, papers, and conferences since she could even remember a date. It was idiocy to even think that an amorous demon would show up on her doorstep tonight. She gestured to the door to the right. "It's all right, it's just water. There's a phone in the kitchen." He was clearly self-conscious about his clothes, which were nearly soaked through, and his shoes, which squeaked as he crossed the kitchen linoleum to the gray and cream plastic wall phone. He seemed to know the number by heart, for he dialed it without hesitation, shaking his head as he rummaged in the drawers for a local phone, as she rummaged in the drawers for a local phone booklet. After a moment, he spoke softly into the receiver, his back to her, and nodded, then hung up the handset. "They'll be coming for me as soon as they can. Do you mind if I wait inside?" His voice was mesmerizingly soft. No, of course not, she said, and shook herself into action. Here, let me get you some tea. Take off your coat. You must be half frozen. You're hardly wearing enough to be out in weather like this. Well, if I'd expected to walk, I could have brought my boots, he said agreeably, but let the coat remain over his shoulders like a cloak. He wiped his forehead, pushing a dark curl back and smoothing the rest of his hair. She could see now it was not black hair, but dark gold, and growing somewhat lighter as it began to dry in the bright white illumination of the kitchen. He eyed her back and observed, "You're not Scots?" "No, I'm American." She scrounged tea bags from the box on the shelf, a prickle between her shoulder blades at turning her back on him. "I'm studying here and rented the cottage for a few weeks. I'm doing my doctorate in folklore." "Ah, fairies and ghoulies and ghasties and all that, eh?" She restrained a sigh and shook her head. "Well, actually, my specialty is urban legends, stories that people tell about life in the city." "Oh, no," he laughed softly. "That's terrible. Here you are, surrounded by some of the most beautiful glens in the world, and every last one of them filled with more than 1,000 years of legend, but none of it urban." He said it was almost a French roll and smiled again, brushing moisture from the shoulders of his coat. The fabric was beginning to lighten in color, and she thought it must have been treated to dry so quickly. But then he continued, "I suppose that's just tales for children to your mind, no?" She busied herself filling the electric kettle and plugging it into the heavy-duty plug by the sink. "No, I think they're quite a legitimate study, but just not my cup of tea," she finished with a sheepish grin. "I'm more interested in the modern legends, how they evolve, how they change, how they illustrate our fears of modern society. The types of stories are all very similar around the world in urban centers, with some cultural differences. It makes it easier to see the patterns, the flow, and the development of similar but different elements." "Well, what are you doing here in the middle of nowhere then? Why not in London?" "Well, I was in London earlier this month, and Edinburgh, but part of my work is making oral tapes, looking at how the old tales intersect with the new ones, and how they influence the cultural perspective. In other words, how does coming from a tradition of fairies, goodies, and ghosties affect the way urban legends develop here as opposed to New York?" The kettle began to stir. She quickly moved to the cabinets and drew down some sugar in a mug and rinsed out the teapot she'd left sitting on the cooker. Within another minute, the kettle started to sing, and she clicked off the big switch by the plug, shutting down the potent 240-volt connection. Talk about living dangerously, she thought. Who needed axe murderers when modern technology was available? She poured the water in the teapot and dipped the bags to start the brewing. She held up the sugar bowl, but he shook his head. After a moment, she poured a cup for him. He took it gratefully, his fingers brushing hers. She found the contact cool and somewhat distant, even as their skin touched. "Will you nay join me?" he said softly. She looked up and found his eyes. Green eyes, she realized suddenly, searching hers in a way that made her toes curl. A spark of something beyond adrenaline spiked through her soul, taking her breath away. She edged backward, not even sure why. "Mine's in the living room, the sitting room," she corrected herself, disoriented. "I'll get it, just a moment." She pushed through the swinging white door to the sitting room and paused a moment in the darkened refuge to clap one hand across her mouth to suppress a nervous giggle. 1 minute she was worried about axe murderers, and the next all she could think of was fairy tales, like those fae who rove the gray road between the worlds seeking a human bride. Blushing in the darkness, she crossed the wee dining